We have reached John chapter 6, and Jesus has begun what's known as the Bread of Life discourse, and we're somewhat halfway through that. I'll read to you from verse 35. Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me, and still you do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never drive away. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all that he has given me, but raise them up at the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. This is a continuation of the passage of Bread of Life, and Jesus is making it very clear to us that his will and the Father's will, his connection with God the Father, is unique and identical, that he has a role which can be played by no other person, because he alone has this element of being one with the Father. And you can see that from here, that the very essence of what he does, the very essence of what he says, is that which provides life to human beings. I'm the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. Now, we saw that last time. We saw the idea that bread, understanding from that, is the idea that it's the very essence, the staple of life itself. Without food, you would die. Without drink, you would die too. And so, in a similar way, without the words of Jesus Christ and without his works, then we will die spiritually. That's the analogy that's being presented here. That's the metaphysical picture that we have before us. But as I told you, he said, you've seen me, and still you do not believe. There's a concept within the Roman Catholic Church called invincible ignorance. And it's an interesting and useful concept in this context here, that no matter what evidence you present to somebody, no matter what arguments you have, no matter how convincing something might be, how rational it is, how logical it might be, how overpoweringly obvious it might be, nevertheless, when faced with certain people, they will still refuse to believe. And here are people who have the incredible experience of being in the very presence of Jesus, of hearing his words directly from his own lips, and yet they still do not believe. The characteristic idea of invincible ignorance is that if this won't convince you, well, nothing will. I think we have to accept that there are people who, no matter what you say to them, or no matter what evidence you provide, there's this obduracy, this stubbornness, this invincibility of ignorance. And there's a lesson here for all of us, therefore, that we need to approach not just Jesus, but maybe most of our lives with an open mind, at least with the idea to consider the possibility that we might be wrong in what we already believe or hold to be true. Consider that somebody else might have the truth and that we need to learn from them. It's a spirit of testing all things and not simply rejecting all things out of hand. Very often we might fall into that very simple error of just rejecting what's been said, either because it's unfamiliar to us and it's new, because it doesn't come from our team or our side, and therefore it's not acceptable. And yet we won't listen to it because of those kind of base reasons, and therefore we don't allow evidence to present themselves to us and to be open to change. These are people such as that here, and as Jesus said, I've told you, you've seen me, and still you do not believe. And it's hard to know what other evidence you could offer. But Jesus picks up this point of the idea that there are some people who will not believe. And it's almost as if it's out of their control. It's not possible for them to change their hearts and minds in any way because that's their characteristic, invincible ignorance. And Jesus goes on to say, all that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. This idea of all those that the Father gives to me are those who have that attitude of heart and mind which would be open to spiritual things, to the words of God, to the words of Christ. And there's an idea here that it's not simply down to us. There are many things about our nature which we have no control over and no say over. We don't have any control over how tall we are. We don't have any control over what colour our eyes are. We have no control over some of our personal characteristics, maybe our personality in some respect. There are things that we do control, but there are things that we don't. And Jesus is pointing out here that maybe within the spiritual realm, we should understand the fact that there are some people who will deliberately remain blind with tunnel vision, who will reject Jesus no matter what the evidence may be. That's just their nature. But on the other hand, the other side of the coin, there are those who will accept Jesus and who will accept the evidence of his words and the brilliance of his insight into human understanding and what we must be doing and our insight into God. All that the Father has given me would characterize those people who are motivated by something maybe beyond themselves, something which the Father has given to Jesus, given in the sense that maybe sent to him, maybe someone who is open to Jesus. And it's a bit like that saying that Jesus had previously, all who have ears to hear, let him hear. That's the idea behind that, is that there are people who do have ears to hear and people who don't have ears to hear. We're obviously not talking about human ears here. We're talking about the ability to listen, to learn, and it's kind of almost like a gift of God, whether you can hear or whether you can't hear. Just as our sight or our height or our strength or our sex is a gift from God. It's determined not by ourselves. And there are many things about us which we don't determine for ourselves. I think that goes against the spirit of the age here, that there is a kind of feeling these days that we can determine anything and everything we like about ourselves. We merely have to choose or declare it. And the idea behind this passage is that that's not so. There are some people who will never believe, and there are some people who are motivated to believe. And those, he says, are referred to as those that the Father gives me. They will come to me, said Jesus, because they will recognize my words as being from God. And whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. And there's a graciousness and an acceptance there, that whoever comes to Jesus and reposes their trust in him, and by trust what I mean is will take on board the things that he says and practice them in their own life, those people will never be rejected by Jesus. There's a mercy and a graciousness within Jesus which we don't often see elsewhere. In fact, we don't see it amongst the religious leaders of Jesus' day, who very often did drive people away, and particularly if they didn't submit to their particular teaching. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. The first statement of there is an astonishing statement. I have come down from heaven. People would reject that immediately, wouldn't they? They would say that I have come down from heaven. How can he say that he's come down from heaven when we know that his father and mother are here? In fact, he talks about that in a moment or two, and this becomes a great stumbling block to them. But I have come down from heaven is the astonishing claim which Jesus makes here, and which many in the crowd find difficult to accept. I have come down from heaven is claiming at least equality with angels and even with God himself. I have come down from heaven, which means that I'm not simply the person who you see before me who was born of a mother and father, but rather I've come down from heaven in the sense that I have been sent by God personally and directly. And you can tell that from the words that I speak. They're unlike anybody else's words, and you should know that and recognize it by just listening to what I have to say. Also from the signs that I give. So I have come down from heaven. No one else can make that claim. It's entirely unique. There's no prophet of God, not in the Old Testament, the New Testament, or beyond the New Testament. There is no prophet whatsoever who ever made the claim that I have come down from heaven. So there's total uniqueness in Jesus' claim, which many would consider outlandish and unbelievable. But it's because of his coming down from heaven that he's declaring that his will is the will of heaven. His purpose is the purpose of heaven. His aim is the same aim as God's aim, which is to do the will of him who sent me. So he's talking about God the Father here. God the Father in heaven, he was with God the Father in heaven, and God the Father has sent him to the earth to be born of a Virgin Mary and into the family of Joseph as a child. And this is, again, an echo of the same opening verse that we have in John's Gospel, which really is the key verse to the whole of John here, that in the beginning was God, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That is the precursor to what's being said here. I've come down from heaven, not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. In other words, whatever I do or say, you can take it that God is doing and saying. As I say, an astonishing and unique claim. And what is the will of God? This is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all that he has given me, but raise them up at the last day. None of those that he's given me, lose none of them. Interesting, because in the immediate case we have the 12 disciples, one of whom was lost, but we can only say that he was obviously not one of those that God had given to Jesus, except in the sense of someone who was destined to betray him. But I shall lose none of all that he's given me, but raise them up on the last day. And there's an eschatology here. There was looking forward to the future. It's not talking about here and now. We're talking about the far distant future of the very last day of creation of the world and its end point when it comes to its conclusion, when there will be a raising up of all those people who have come to Jesus. Again, the claim is an unprecedented one. No one else has ever said such things as this. He goes on to explain the Father's will here. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life and be raised up at the last day. Now, here is one of the clearest statements of the entire eschatology of Jesus Christ. The purpose of his coming is rooted in the fact, in the future, that on the last day, those people who put their trust in Jesus Christ will have eternal life and will be raised up at the last day. This is the nature of salvation. This is the victory over death. This is the winning against Thanatos, the final enemy against which all mankind falls, against death itself. And yet Jesus' astonishing claims are topped by an even greater claim here, that everyone who looks to the Son, and by looks to the Son we mean doesn't look to the Pharisees, doesn't look to anywhere else, but looks to Jesus Christ for guidance, for wisdom, for instruction, for how to live their life, for where to put their trust, to look at Jesus as the one who is the guide for all the things that they do, and believes in him, shall have eternal life. Eternal life being life which does not come to an end. And I will raise him up at the last day, for which we can only understand this to be a physical resurrection, because the last day of judgment is the day when the dead will rise, as is well explained here. I'll just finish with one last section here, because this is the main problem that the Jews had with Jesus. No, in fact, I'd probably better finish here, and I'll leave that to the next part.